The question is simple. Did the police know who the Zodiac Killer was? The short answer is no. They never made an arrest. The case is still open in several jurisdictions. But that's the official answer. The real answer, the one that lives in the dusty file cabinets in the minds of retired detectives, is a lot more complicated. They didn't know. Not for sure. Not in a way they could prove to a jury, but they had ideas. They had suspects, and one man, more than any other, kept them up at night. This story isn't about a solved case. It's about the frustrating, maddening, and haunting space between suspicion and certainty. It's about how close the police came and why close was never good enough. The terror started in the late 1960s in Northern California. A killer who wasn't just satisfied with murder. He needed credit. He sent letters to the newspapers taunting the police, bragging about his crimes. He included cryptic ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. He gave himself a name, the Zodiac. He wore a strange, hooded costume during one of his attacks. He was a phantom, a boogeyman who created his own myth. He claimed to have killed 37 people, though investigators have only confirmed 5 deaths. The attacks were brutal and seemingly random. A young couple in a lover's lane. Another couple at a remote park. A taxi driver in the middle of San Francisco. The randomness was part of the fear. He could be anyone, anywhere. The police were swamped. With tips poured in, hundreds and thousands of people were looked at. The investigation spanned multiple counties, multiple police departments. It was a mess of jurisdictions and egos. But through the noise, a few names started to surface again and again. These weren't just random tips. These were men with strange stories, unsettling coincidences, and dark shadows in their past. These were the main suspects. Let's start with the big one, Arthur Leigh Allen. If you've heard one name connected to the Zodiac case, it's probably his. For decades, he was the prime suspect, the focus of intense police scrutiny, and the story of why is a lesson in circumstantial evidence. It's a mountain of maybes. The first time police heard Allen's name was in 1969, and a man named Don Chaney, who had been a friend of Allen's, went to the police. He told them a disturbing story. Years earlier, Allen had talked to him. He said he was writing a story about a man who hunts people with a gun and a flashlight, a man who calls himself Zodiac. He would taunt the police with letters. He would attach a flashlight to his gun to see better at night. He said the most dangerous game was hunting humans. He even told Chaney his plan would start with killing kids on a school bus. This was years before the Zodiac Killer threatened to shoot up a school bus in one of his letters. Now that was a huge red flag. The police started digging into Arthur Leigh Allen, and the more they dug, the weirder it got. Allen had been a school teacher. He was fired for inappropriate conduct with students. He was a Navy man, and he'd been trained in codes and ciphers. He knew how to handle weapons. He was intelligent. He was also a loner and outcast. He lived with his mother in a basement apartment in Vallejo, right in the heart of Zodiac territory. He was near the scene of the first Zodiac attack on Lake Herman Road. In fact, he was a person of interest in that case before the Zodiac letters even started, just because he was known to be a local creep. The physical evidence seemed to line up too. A survivor of the Lake Berryessa attack, Brian Hartnell, described the killer's boots. He said they were military-style boots, maybe from the Wing Walker brand. When police searched Allen's home years later, they found a pair of Wing Walker boots in his size. Hartnell also described the killer as heavyset, which Allen was. Then there was the watch. Allen wore a Zodiac brand watch. The logo on the watch was a circle with a cross through it, the same symbol the killer used to sign his letters. When police asked him about it, Allen said he got it as a Christmas gift. A coincidence, he claimed. A really, really big coincidence. Police interviewed Allen several times. The first time, in 1969, he was cagey. He said he was at Pismo Beach on the day of the Lake Berryessa attacks. He said he went scuba diving. He couldn't really prove it, but what really stood out to the detectives was his demeanor. He was smart, a bit arrogant. He seemed to enjoy the attention. He even volunteered the fact that his favorite book was The Most Dangerous Game, the same short story Chaney had mentioned. He was practically waving red flags in their faces. So the police had a man who talked about killing people and calling himself Zodiac before the murder started. A man who lived in the right area. A man who owned the right kind of boots and the right brand of watch. A man who matched the general physical description. A man with a history of disturbing behavior. He seemed like the perfect fit. Case closed, right? Not even close. This is where the Zodiac case becomes so frustrating. For every piece of evidence that pointed to Allen, another piece pointed away. First, the physical evidence that really mattered. The hard stuff. The fingerprints found at one of the crime scenes inside Paul Stein's taxi did not match Arthur Leigh Allen. Police collected many partial prints, but none were his. That's a big problem. Then, the handwriting. The Zodiac wrote dozens of letters. The police had a team of handwriting experts analyze them. They compared the Zodiac's writing to samples of Allen's. The conclusion? They didn't match. Again, a huge blow to the theory. Some people argued that Allen could have disguised his handwriting or written with his other hand. It's possible, but it's not evidence, it's speculation. The DNA evidence came much later. In the early 2000s, investigators were able to get a partial DNA profile from the saliva on the stamps and envelopes of the Zodiac letters. They compared it to DNA from Arthur Leigh Allen. He had died in 1992, but they had samples from his medical records and brain tissue. And the result, no match. And what about the eyewitnesses? Brian Hartnell, the man who survived the brutal stabbing at Lake Berryessa, was shown a photo lineup with Allen in it years later. He didn't pick him, he said he couldn't be sure. Another key witness was Mike Mageau, who survived the shooting at Blue Rock Springs. He also saw a photo lineup with Allen. He didn't pick him out either. In fact, he pointed to another man. The police dispatcher who took a call from the Zodiac after that shooting, Nancy Slover, listened to a recording of Allen's voice. She said it wasn't him. So the police were stuck. They had this mountain of circumstantial evidence. The stories from his friend. The watch. The boots, the location, it all felt right. It painted a picture of a man who could absolutely be the Zodiac. But the hard scientific evidence, the kind that stands up in court, just wasn't there. The fingerprints, the handwriting, the DNA, the eyewitnesses, they all pointed away from him. The lead investigator from the Vallejo Police Department, Jack Mulanix, believed it was Allen. He was convinced. Robert Graysmith, the newspaper cartoonist who became obsessed with the case and wrote the book Zodiac, was also convinced it was Allen. To them, the circumstantial case was just too strong to ignore. They believed Allen was just a cunning suspect who managed to beat this. He was a guy who knew how police worked and how to cover his tracks, but suspicion, no matter how strong, isn't proof. And so Arthur Leigh Allen died a free man, forever the #1 suspect in a case that was never solved. He remains a ghost in the machine, the most compelling and frustrating dead end in American crime history. But Allen wasn't the only person police were looking at. Over the years, other names came up. Some were flashes in the pan, quickly dismissed. Others stuck around, developing their own dedicated followers and theories. Another compelling suspect was a man named Richard Gaikowski. He wasn't on the police's radar in the same way Allen was, at least not initially. His name gained more traction years later, thanks to independent researchers. But the case for him is surprisingly detailed. Gaikowski worked for a counterculture newspaper in San Francisco called Good Times. He was a writer and editor. His timeline is what first raises eyebrows. He worked as an army medic, so he had medical training. He was also trained in communications and codes. He was in the Bay Area during the entire Zodiac period. And here's the strange part. His newspaper columns stopped for a few weeks right after some of the Zodiac letters were sent. It was as if he was busy with other things. Then, a Zodiac letter would arrive, and soon after, his column would start up again. Coincidence? Maybe. But there's more. The Zodiac made a phone call to the police after the Blue Rock Springs shooting. The dispatcher, Nancy Slover, described his voice as soft, measured, almost rehearsed. Years later, an investigator played her a recording of Richard Gaikowski's voice from a documentary he had worked on. Slover listened. She became emotional. She said, "That's the voice." It was the first time in over 30 years she had identified a voice as being the killer's. That's a powerful moment. But memory is a tricky thing. Could she really be sure after so many decades? Then there are the ciphers. One of the unsolved ciphers contained a string of characters that some people believe, when anagrammed, spell out Richard Gaikowski's name. It's a stretch, and it requires a lot of interpretation. It's not a clean solve. But it's another one of those strange coincidences that pile up. The Zodiac also sent a letter with the text, "My name is Sunring." The cipher that followed has never been solved. But some codebreakers believe they found the name Gek inside it. Again, it's not definitive, it's a theory. Physically, Gaikowski looked a lot like the composite sketch of the Zodiac, particularly the one made after the murder of the taxi driver, Paul Stein. He had a similar face shape, a widow's peak, and wore glasses. The case against Gaikowski is built on patterns and connections. His work at the Good Times newspaper is central to the theory. The paper used slang and phrases that were similar to those used in the Zodiac letters. They were involved in the counterculture scene, which some people think the Zodiac was mocking or a part of. It's a compelling narrative. The intellectual newspaperman playing a game with the police and the public. But, just like with Allen, there's no smoking gun. No fingerprint, no DNA match. The case is purely circumstantial, built on interpretations of his writing and a decades-old voice identification. He remains a fascinating what-if. A third name that often comes up is Lawrence Kane. His name was actually Larry Kane, but he sometimes went by the last name K. This makes researching him a little confusing. Kane was a career criminal with a long rap sheet. He had a history of mental illness and had been diagnosed with impulse control problems. He had worked for the same company as Darlene Ferrin, one of the Zodiac's victims. That's a direct connection. Darlene Ferrin's sister Pam claimed that a man named Larry had been stalking Darlene in the weeks before her murder. She said he was a strange, scary man. Years later, when she was shown a photo of Lawrence Kane, she identified him as the man who had been following her sister. Another potential victim, Donna Lass, disappeared from South Lake Tahoe in 1970. The Zodiac sent a postcard that many believe was about her murder, though her body was never found. Lawrence Kane lived near where Donna Lass worked and disappeared. He had even worked at the same hotel as her. Another chilling connection, and just like with Gaikowski, some amateur sleuths believe they found Kane's name hidden in one of the ciphers. It's the same debate. Is it a real clue or are people just seeing what they want to see? The police did look into Kane. A detective who interviewed him said he was a con man and was very slippery. He was a person of interest. But again, the trail went cold. They could never place him at the scene of any of the crimes. The connections to the victims were tantalizing, but they weren't proof of murder. He was another shadow, another man with a dark past who fit the profile but could never be definitively tied to the crimes. In more recent years, a new, sensational suspect has emerged. His name is Earl Van Best Jr. This theory didn't come from the police or old case files. It came from a book written by a man named Gary Stewart. Stewart claims that his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the Zodiac Killer. Stewart's book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, lays out a dramatic case. He claims he was abandoned by his father as an infant and only discovered his identity late in life. As he researched his father, he began to see disturbing parallels to the Zodiac case. The most striking piece of evidence is visual. Stewart provides a picture of his father from an old marriage license. When you place it side by side with the police sketch of the Zodiac, the resemblance is uncanny. It's perhaps the closest physical match of any major suspect. They have the same glasses, the same hairline, the same facial structure. It's genuinely chilling. Stewart also claims his father's handwriting is a match to the Zodiac's. He hired a handwriting expert who agreed. The marriage certificate his father signed has bizarre looping handwriting that does look similar to the killer's. He also points to a scar on his father's forehead, which he believes matches a fingerprint left by the Zodiac in Paul Stein's cab. He says the scar tissue would leave a unique print. The story itself is compelling. A man with a criminal past, a history of abandoning his family, who had an interest in ciphers, and opera the Zodiac made references to. The Mikado. Stewart believes his father's entire life was a performance, and the Zodiac persona was his greatest, most terrible creation. But there are serious problems with this theory. First, it comes from a book written by the suspect's son who has a financial interest in the story being true. That doesn't mean it's false, but it means we have to be skeptical. Second, the San Francisco Police Department has been very dismissive of the claims. They have said that the evidence presented by Stewart is not convincing. They have looked at it, and they are not pursuing Earl Van Best Jr. as a strong suspect. The handwriting analysis is disputed. The fingerprint theory is just that, a theory. There is very little to place Earl Van Best Jr. in the Bay Area during the specific times of the murder. So, like the others, he remains a possibility, but a very controversial one. His case is built on a stunning visual match and a son's passionate, but perhaps biased, investigation. So we have these four men. Allen, the prime suspect of the police, with a mountain of circumstantial evidence against him, but no hard proof. Gaikowski, the newspaperman, with a compelling timeline and a voice identification decades after the fact. Kane, the career criminal, with disturbing connections to two of the victims. And Van Best Jr., the father from a book, with a face that perfectly matches the sketch. Why was none of them ever arrested? Why did the biggest manhunt in California history come up empty? The answer lies in limitations of the time and the nature of the killer himself. Forensic science in the 1960s and 70s was nothing like it is today. DNA analysis was science fiction. Fingerprint technology was good, but you needed a clean, full print. The Zodiac was smart. He was careful. At the Lake Berryessa crime scene, he left behind boot prints, but he walked carefully to avoid leaving clear impressions. In the taxi, he wiped down the car, but he missed a few spots. The prints he did leave were partial and smudged. They weren't enough. The killer's main method of communication, the letters, was both a blessing and a curse for police. They provided clues, handwriting samples, psychological insights, potential timelines. But they also created a huge amount of noise. The ciphers sent investigators, both professional and amateur, down countless rabbit holes. They were a brilliant distraction. The Zodiac controlled the narrative, and he sent the police chasing shadows. And the evidence against each suspect was flawed in a critical way. It was almost all circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful. If you have enough of it, you can get a conviction. But in this case, for every piece of circumstantial evidence pointing at a suspect, there was a major piece of hard evidence pointing away. For Allen, you have the stories and the watch, but you have mismatched prints and DNA. That's a giant hole in the prosecution's case. A defense attorney would tear that apart. The police have been obsessed with my client for years, he would say. They ignored the science because they wanted it to be him, and he would be right. For Gaikowski, you have a voice ID from a traumatized witness 30 years later. Is that reliable? Maybe not. You have theories about his name in ciphers, but that's not evidence. It's a fun puzzle for the internet, not something you can show a jury. For Kane and Van Best Jr., the cases are even thinner, relying on family testimony, disputed handwriting, and visual similarities. It's smoke, it's not fire. The police, especially the detectives in Vallejo and San Francisco, probably did believe they knew who it was. Most of them went to their graves believing it was Arthur Leigh Allen. They just couldn't prove it. They couldn't get over that final hurdle. They couldn't find the one piece of evidence that tied it all together. The gun, the bloody knife, a clear confession. It never came, and that is the real tragedy of the Zodiac case. It's not just that people were murdered, it's that the killer won. He created a puzzle that could never be solved. He terrorized a region and then simply vanished, leaving behind a legacy of fear and frustration. He gave the police just enough to keep them chasing him for 50 years, but never enough to catch him. Did the police know his identity? No. They had a name. They had a face. They had a story that fit. They had a man in a basement apartment in Vallejo who owned a Zodiac watch and talked about hunting people for sport. They had a deep, gnawing suspicion that felt like certainty. But in the eyes of the law, a feeling isn't enough. And so the Zodiac remains a ghost, a question mark, a killer who was known but never caught.